Back so soon. I thought I would do a really quick follow-up of my last video, Lady Trouble, when I realized that we must have carried some of our ideology with us when we crossed the Cyclades while we were migrating to Crete. So I thought I would check the Balkan Peninsula to see if I can find anything resembling that ideology. And once again, I was not disappointed. This is a gift that keeps on giving. Now, I'm going to stop calling us the Minoans from here on out because I think I've proven we called ourselves the Kapter, so I'm going to call us that. We're going to begin with a broad survey of the Neolithic Balkans. That way we can get a pretty good idea of the who and the where and the when that we're going to be looking at. But first, you need to understand that there were two migrations of farmers out of Turkey and into the Balkan Peninsula, and we were in that second wave. And it kind of pisses me off that I have to keep stressing this, because whenever people argue over the ultimate origin of the Indo-European language, they keep comparing that first group with the people living on the steppes of Russia, when they obviously should be looking at us. Lots of new information has come in the last year alone. Really stunning work. We know that this first group came ultimately in from northwest Turkey and settled in modern-day Serbia. Then they eventually spread north, where they are known as a linear pottery culture. We also found out recently from genetic studies that they had married some of the natives, and their descendants eventually moved across the Mediterranean and all the way to Spain. Now, here's where we come in. We naturally take a southern route and concentrate on Greece and Crete. Then, 500 to 600 years later, we start spreading north, where we're known as the Vintia. And then further north still, where we're known as the Sopot and the Lingio. I talk about that in my video, The Gods Descend. At the same time as that last extension, another group of Anatolians start coming in from the western shore of the Black Sea and are known as the Hamangia. And usually it is spelled Hamangia. But the archaeology indicates they didn't stay, that it was more of a transit location. It was probably an entry point for the Sopot and the Lingial immigrants. Then, about 400 to 500 years after that, we start moving north. I haven't seen any DNA on the Cucuteni Trypillian people, but I know they're Anatolians. They are master figurine makers, a mark par excellence of Anatolian culture. And they build huge settlements that dwarf the first city-states of Mesopotamia. And at this stage in history, we're the only people in the world with the wherewithal to build such societies. I call them proto-cities. The only thing they seem to have lacked is literacy, and they might have even had that. Now, people are always quick to say that the Minoans came directly from Anatolia, and I agreed in the beginning. But like the first Balkan farmers, there were two migrations to Crete. The first in 6500 BC, and then the second 3,000 years later when my ancestors started streaming in from the Balkans. Our cousins moved on to the steppes of Russia, and some went as far as India. Which is why I look back to the Balkans. Now, in Lady Trouble, I showed that the idea of a syzygy was very important to us. I showed that the word is a Kapter word and not a Greek word, and I also showed that its very spelling in the linear A writing system indicates that that writing system was built around the concept, which means it has to be older than the system, so we're looking at before 2500 BC. Well, I'm happy to report that the syzygy shows up loud and clear in Cucuteni figurines, and maybe even with the Vintia. Let's get a good look at these lovelies, the Figurines of Old Europe by Douglas W. Bailey. When I finally get around to doing a video on these figurines, I'm going to rely very heavily on Dr. Bailey's book, Prehistoric Figurines, Representation and Corporeality in the Neolithic. I think it's safe to say this is the go-to man on this topic. We have found a dozen beautifully modeled figurines representing half a dozen syzygy pairs. This is from Dr. Bailey's book, one of the pairs. They all have an awkward forward-sloped position. The female is covered in tattoos or a tightly fitted cloth. The man is largely uncloaked, but what he is wearing is a masculine counterpart to the woman's garb. He's got the womanly hips we saw in Italy and on Crete. And what's going on here? Well, their heads are a clue. They've got bird heads. And notice the sharp curves on their shoulders. All these figurines have those. Perfect to hold a harness for a pair of wings. Their legs don't end in feet, but rather points. Perfect to slip on a pair of bird feet. The same for this beautiful lady. So what are we to make of all those markings all over her body and that posture? Well, like I said, they're bird people. Bird feathers tightly hug their bodies, which are also swept forward, just like our figurines. And just like bird tails help them balance out, I'm sure the wings on the figurines and the feet help balance them out. So we've got our figurines, and our birds, and our syzygy. a threefer. And this should immediately remind you of our petroglyphs in Sweden that I used to prove we called ourselves the Kapter. The Kapter symbol for Ka is dead center. The bird heads, the long legs, and the long arms stretching right out from their Ka, their center of psychological and spiritual gravity. With those arms, they display their wings. They are water birds. Once again, Kapter is Ka-ter, wing spirit. When I think about the high quality of these Kukatini figurines, certainly as a group, and the size of these settlements, I now understand why the Indo-European language has such a strong steppe flavor. This was the new world for us, with its bold new ideas. I suspect we had a classic age here, similar to the classic age of Greece. And it is here that I must express my annoyance with the linguistic community. Archaeologists have been implicitly begging with you for years to refresh your model on the origin of the Indo-European language. There is 0% evidence your boys ever made it to Anatolian territory, or even their backyard. Meanwhile, hello, settlements that dwarf the original city-states of Mesopotamia? Loads of Anatolian figurines? When are you going to get it through your thick skull that we are the Aryans, and we spoke the original Indo-European language? But let me throw something in your lap. This is from the Belgrade City Museum in Serbia. A bird-headed person, so you're looking at one of us, on a cart, with swastikas, in the Balkans. You will never get more Aryan than a man wearing swastikas in a chariot. And notice they're spinning in opposite directions. This might be a consciously modeled syzygy of swastikas, one spinning into the unconscious, the other spinning out of it. I defy you to find something like this on the steppes of Russia. So you need to reorient and take advantage of the lead that I'm handing you. This is most important. 2 waves of farmers, we were the second. Speaking of the Belgrade City Museum, this man helped me out here. Arrangement of Vinca figurines, a study of social structure and organization. I knew we created a few bird images, but it didn't really seem to be a thing for us. I thought at first we got the bird people idea from the Kukatini. We're known for our space aliens. Seriously, a lot of people think we're from outer space. I sometimes wonder about that myself. So when I saw these photos for the first time, my first thought was, there they are, bird people. But I ain't saying nothing about no bird people in my video, because if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times. As crazy as my theories sound, I'm actually very conservative. These could just be people with big noses, and I could just have bird on the brain. But I'll be damned, we're the bird people. All other figurines have a stout cylindrical body and a bird-like head, characteristic of the late Vinca period. So we started identifying with birds, good lord, almost 7,000 years ago in Serbia. No wonder Pipatuna is always showing up in my dreams. Now let's revisit the Phoenix dream again from Lady Trouble. I left something out. I'm standing on a small hill and somebody's in front of me. My point of view is behind him and I'm looking at myself. I can also see the back of his head. He has me cornered and I can't run anymore. I suddenly erupt into light and it envelops the world. I am the Phoenix. I forgot to tell you, before I became the Phoenix, I held out my arms, a pose that you must have seen in hundreds if not thousands of Vinca figurines throughout their history. I call this the sunflower pose. That's right, I had a name for this pose, years before I ever started this research, because I use it. In my prayers, when I'm stuck in life, I naturally go into the sunflower pose, and I pray in tongues, in private like you're supposed to, because you often don't know what you're supposed to pray. And I don't know exactly what's happening, but when I pray in tongues in the sunflower pose, the best I can describe it is the deck is reshuffled. Or to use another metaphor, it's like the old foundation is thrown out and replaced with a better one. This is not a power pose, although we have one of those, or an unleashing pose. A flower faces the sun so that it can receive its light, although typically for me, I'm a dog that goes down on its back to show its belly. This is a surrender pose. You are absolutely helpless. You cannot defend yourself. You certainly cannot attack. And you cannot resist the will of God, which is the point. I'm gratified to see so many examples of the sunflower pose in Vinca figurines, because it confirms my suspicion that it is in the Balkans in the late Neolithic that we first heard God's voice. Like Jean Grey in the comics, I'm not actually the Phoenix. The Phoenix is the Phoenix. I open my heart and let her do her work. You see a lot of specific poses used over and over again in Minoan Crete. But you don't see that one, except in one form or another with female divinities, just like the phoenix. Okay, we've seen the syzygy and the bird people from Lady Trouble. We can't forget the Axis Mundi and the Vital Stones. Normally, I don't use a source like messagetoeagle.com, but according to that site, we had the first vital stone in the world. I have not been able to confirm that anywhere else. I tentatively credit that because we know we had it with us in the Cyclades, and as I said, we obsessed over the Axis Mundi, so it wouldn't surprise me. But I've got a surprise for you. No doubt you've heard about Abraham, who's the father of the Israelites and some of the Arabs. Well, surprise, surprise. Abraham and his family were well known on Kapter Crete, and on 3 different occasions their stories have shown up in Kapter art. Now, I've said several times that our soul is a Christian soul, and has been long before Christianity was unveiled. Well, now it looks like we have the Old Testament, or rather, stories from the Old Testament. And all of these would be from before the Exodus, because at the same time that was happening in Egypt, we were getting exiled from Crete, and all of this disappeared with us. Now get ready to be shocked. If we found written accounts of the biblical patriarchs on Kapter Crete, they would not be more explicit than what you're about to see. Let's start with that vital stone. One of which we have in Genesis 28:10 through 19. You will notice some of this text is in bold. I thought that was prudent to do that since we can get a better look at where these stories came from. The regular text is the J source, Yahwist. When King Solomon died, the kingdom split in 2. This is from the southern kingdom of Judah, based in Jerusalem. In bold, we have the E source, the Elohist. This is from the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital in Samaria. Everything in red will be important. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. You see how they go between God and the Lord? The southern source uses the Lord, the northern source uses God. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Jacob treats this as a very important rock because he realizes it is a vital stone. In fact, this is where the word comes from, Bethel, house of God. Bethel is in the northern kingdom of Israel, so its location there means the northern kingdom is the center of the world, which is why the northerners would be happy to remember the story and the southerners would be happy to forget it. Here's how I want you to think about this ladder. We have the axis mundi, which is an axle. It's a straight line. Here's how you can have a perfectly serviceable ladder that's also a straight line. I got that idea from the Kapter because they actually show what Jacob's ladder looked like. An anchor on either end, heaven and earth. Just a couple of rungs, the minimum required to convey the message in the tiny space allowed. Jacob falls asleep on a rock, and the rock is shaped like a pillar. His head bubbles away as he dreams and moves into sacred space. There are angels flying around. Here they're insects. Angels are aliens. If you don't believe me, just look at the book of Ezekiel. Goddess stands over him. So, in Lady Trouble, I make the case that God is a syzygy, mother on earth, father in heaven. That's actually going to show up again. There's ambiguity in the Hebrew about where God is standing. That detail is coming from the southern kingdom of Judah. They're calling him Lord. On top of the ladder, next to Jacob, standing over him. That's because God is with him on earth and above him in heaven. So the answer is yes, everywhere. But there's another story to the right, specifically dealing with Jacob and tree limbs. This is a very strange story and nobody knows what's going on. As you can see, this is all Yahwist, so it's coming out of Jerusalem. Jacob makes an offer to his uncle Laban about which animals will belong to whom. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches, from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the inner white wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself, and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals, so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban, and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous, and came to own large flocks, and females and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Nobody today knows exactly what's going on. The Kapter knew, and I can fill you in on the background, but I don't know what the thinking was behind the tree limbs and the goat breeding. But let's walk this story back a bit. Not to put too fine a point to it, but Jacob was a con artist. He had swindled his twin brothers so badly back in the Promised Land that he had to flee to his grandfather Abraham's old homeland just to stay alive. While there, he meets his uncle Laban, who screws him over good. But don't feel sorry for Jacob, because he got exactly what he deserved. But by this time, he had already paid for his crime. Nevertheless, there was no way dear old Uncle Laban was going to remove his hooks from the boy voluntarily. But there's a twist to Jacob's con artistry. His mother, Rebekah, was his partner in crime. In Mesopotamia, con artist Jacob is coming back, and here, like there, mother was going to lend a helping hand. The mother, because in Kapter iconography, the tree is a symbol for mother. And so now we have a lovely literary parallel with the flip. Mom helps her boy get away with his cons for ill in the beginning. Mother helps her son pull his cons to save him in the end. Now, mother carries on in the Old Testament in the person of wisdom. And the hallmark of wisdom is she is deeply practical. And Jacob needs that. He has to deal with a conniving uncle and the ripe reality of breeding goats. Mother to the rescue. Now, you're about to see another lovely literary flip. In the very next story, the engine that drives the drama will be looking and watching and listening. Now, this is too much of a coincidence. On the very same ring that we have this weird image of a man pulling on tree limbs, we have a perfectly serviceable representation of Jacob's ladder. This has to be the patriarch Jacob, who's later known as Israel. Now, in the Bible, we know who the patriarchs are, and we know they're important, so it shouldn't be a surprise that we find them on our iconography. Now, in Lady Trouble, I talk about Carl Jung's collective unconscious and how it often behaves as a racial memory. I think we're seeing something like this here with me. Here are those insects again, divine messengers. To the Kapter, insects were good things. And notice the axis mundi beneath her. Gods and humans were communing now, which is exactly why we invented the wheel, to bring us together. In the previous image, of course, the axis was the ladder. Insects are certainly not good things in this culture. But I had a dream where I opened a closet and some alien skin fell out. It's when I was in Jungian therapy, like the skin these aliens shed in the movies. It took me years to figure this out because this is supposed to be dangerous. Whenever somebody finds a skin, that usually means the alien's not far behind and they're not long in this world. But I think that's my racial memory deliberately overruling the modern view. The alien skin was good news. I had transformed. I've had a couple of alien figurines guarding my front door and my bedroom window for more than a decade now. I once had a spider behind my TV for several months and left it there. I felt like it was also protecting me. And this year, I finally put down some serious money on a China pattern that I've been obsessing over for years. Money I don't really have. I've always said that if I were an emperor, I would be known as the Dragonfly Emperor. So my unconscious has associations with insects that perfectly captures the experience of looking at insects on Kapter seals, because I am a Kapter. Now let's have one last look at Scripture before we finish this epilogue. Another one with weird specific detail. This one comes from the northern kingdom of Israel. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance of my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. And God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. Sarah sees Hagar and has a murderous hatred for her. She hears the boy mocking her son Isaac. Hagar cannot bear to see the child die. And now the flip, just like with Jacob and Laban. God hears the boy crying. God opens Hagar's eyes, and now Hagar sees the water, which will save her. That's lovely, but there's also a lesson. We must look through God's eyes and listen with his ears. But there's another way we can look at a literary flip. We can also call it a literary syzygy. Good and bad, mother and father, the two poles of a battery. Without this inherent polarity, there wouldn't be any energy to move anything forward, whether it's a story or a person, or the universe. See the eye? See the ear? God hears the boy. He makes her see what he sees. See the bow in father's hand? Hagar's a bow shot away from her baby. There's no way that's an accident. He is important because a woman with no husband has no protector. Father is now her protector, and she will no longer have to weep, as she so poignantly does here. Mother spectates, like us. She suffers with her daughter, as the Virgin suffers with us in our own despair. Tears trickled out of Hagar's transmogrified head. I never noticed those tears until I realized this was Hagar. Like Jacob, she is now in the land of God and doesn't see with the same eyes we do anymore. But also like Jacob, she might be in an altered state. He is dreaming. She might be hallucinating from extreme dehydration and exposure. And maybe this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's the only way our defenses can be beat down and the veil can be lifted for us. She is bent over and has collapsed to her knees. She can't even hold up her own weight anymore. I'm baffled as to how so much pathos can pour out of the few dozen strokes needed to make this seal. This artist is a genius. I'm happy I'm not reading this script in public. I have to stop her tears because I have to stop my tears. And notice the ethereal divinity this artist conveys. I've never seen anything like this, and it certainly agrees with this observation. One big surprise is the almost complete absence from Mycenaean seals of representations of a static divine epiphany. There is persuasive linguistic and textual evidence that the Mycenaean Greeks were influenced by Minoan notions of divine apparition in constructing their beliefs of what gods are and how they manifest themselves to human beings. They, and the later Greeks, used a word for deity, theos, constructed from a different Indo-European root than in other Indo-European cultures. Especially when used in compound words, the root thes conveys the peculiar sense of the eerily instantaneous presence of a supernatural force. Yet unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans did not attempt to display this aspect of divinity pictorially, probably because at the time they didn't have the skills to do that. The peculiar sense of the eerily instantaneous presence of a supernatural force. That is exactly what we have here. I still pull secrets out of this tiny masterpiece, and I've seen it 100 times. The axis mundi once again lies beneath Hagar. There are 2 stones instead of the usual 1, so whereas the others are vitals, only one of these probably is. Since she's out in the wilderness, they convey that by adding another rock, and a wild bush behind them both, which is probably where she's laid her son. Now the Greeks called this an omphalos, a navel, which means we should see an umbilical cord somewhere in Kapter art, but we never do. This confirms my speculation in Lady Trouble that this was a Greek change to demote the lady. It also strongly supports my argument that our meditation on the spinning stars above and the axis connecting heaven and earth was our inspiration when we invented the wheel. And in a very gratifying touch for my case in Lady Trouble, both persons of the syzygy are present. Whenever you see a person in heaven in Kapter art, it's always Father. That's why I insist on a syzygy, whereas everyone else insists we only worship Mother. Here the nature of their bond is elegantly demonstrated. Bubbles swirl out of her head towards him. Bubbles swirl from his body towards her. Together they imply a whirlpool, bringing Mother and Father together. This is the water that Hagar desperately needs to see to survive, and this is the stream of water we must all drink from if we are to live forever. The bow and Father's hand form the central axis of the whirlpool. This whirlpool is the One. And look, beneath them, they're on a stage. You see this on other Kapter seals. I think we wrote the first tragedies for the stage, and they were Bible stories. We must have played them out at our so-called palaces, which are actually for everybody. And so, pondering the union of Father and Mother, we now know what this is all about. The famous Labyrinth, the face of Father, the face of Mother, united as the one by the axis. Very simple, very elegant, like the lines of our image of Hagar. It says so much with so little. The Kapter version of the crucifix. And this is the tragedy. What happens if you are not the one? And you are not the one, and I am not the one. So what about us? What becomes of us? And the answer is, you wait on God, and He will not forget you. And now I have a question for you. Athens or Jerusalem? Which one is more important? Well, that's impossible to answer. But it's not impossible to believe that once upon a time on a blessed island, they were the same city. And it's also not impossible to believe that 2,000 years ago, with the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, they became one city again, in Christ's church. And what Christ has joined together, He will suffer no man to put asunder.